Welcome to Leveling Up Mental Health, a podcast where we explore the intersection of video games and mental health. I'm one of your hosts, Andrew Nicholson.
And I'm the other host, Adolyn H.
I am a local Calgary psychologist.
And I am a global actor.
Global?
Yeah, you're local, I'm global.
Nice. And together, we love video games.
I thought we were going to say each other.
We do love each other. That's true. On this episode, we're super excited. We have a wonderful guest named Kenzie Gordon, who is an academic, a researcher, and an expert in this area of gender-based violence and video games, which we thought was a very, very interesting topic, a very relevant topic, and something we wanted to dive into with somebody who knew what they were talking about.
Yes, not us. We don't know anything.
We're interested. We're curious.
And we're always learning.
That's right. Well done. So we're excited to dive into this interview. I think we cover a lot of really interesting topics. Hopefully people get something out of it. Gender-based violence, we'll get into kind of the definitions in our interview with Kenzie. She does a great job of explaining what that means. But it's generally an umbrella term that covers sexual violence, domestic violence, kind of any violence within that general category. And it's really neat because she talks about violence prevention and the role video games can potentially play in that.
Yeah, the positive role that video games can have in preventing violence.
Right. There's always this question of do violent video games cause violence? And we get into that in the interview. But I think it's really cool that we talk to somebody who is on this other side of it and says, how can we actually use these to better our world?
Exactly. And don't forget to stick around after the interview for our post-interview analysis.
Debrief. So without further ado, let's get to the interview.
Friendship!
Woo!
Today, we are so excited to have an incredible guest with us, a scholar, a researcher, a professor, and an avid video game fan as well. Kenzie Gordon, welcome.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
We're so happy to have you here. Why don't you start with giving us a quick introduction of who you are, what area you work in, and then we'll jump right in.
Perfect. Yeah. So my name is Kenzie Gordon. I use she, her pronouns. I am a trained social worker, and for the last 9 years or so, I have been a graduate student at the University of Alberta in the discipline of critical game studies. So there's quite a few things that fall under that remit, but the primary focus of my work has been what are the intersections of gender-based violence in video games, and how can games kind of be leveraged towards the violence prevention movement. So yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Well, we're super excited to have you here. And that was one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you. I think it's such an interesting area, and we'll get all into the weeds of it, hopefully. But even just that flip, so often the conversation is around maybe the negative impact of video games on, perpetuating violence, sexual violence, gender-based violence. And you have this interesting slant on how can we actually use them to benefit. So we'll talk lots about that. But the first thing we want to know, you're a fan of video games as yourself as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are some of your favorite games? What games are you playing these days?
Yeah. Favorite games, I'm from Edmonton, and so I am legally obligated to be sworn fealty to BioWare.
That's fair.
So
All hail BioWare. Yes,
all
yes,
hail
yes.
BioWare.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I grew up on the first two Baldur's Gate games. One of my kids is actually named after a character in Baldur's Gate 1 and 2.
Excellent.
Should we guess? No.
I mean,
No. That's awesome. Andrew and I grew up playing Baldur's Gate together. The co-op mode has served many memories for us. So
Yeah.
that's amazing to hear.
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, that's so lovely. Yeah, so I grew up playing Baldur's Gate, among many other games, of course, and, Mass Effect, Dragon Age, all of these things are phenomenal. These days, ironically, I don't have very much time to play video games, but I am wrapping up my dissertation, which is on Horizon Zero Dawn and Horizon Forbidden West. So that lives rent-free in, 60% of my subconscious mind.
Yeah, no kidding. The dissertation will do that too. It just makes it burrow into your brain. Yeah, that's very cool. I was going to ask about that actually, because I saw, I think in your CV, you'd written a chapter about Horizon. So clearly, I'm guessing you're a fan of the games, and there's lots that you're drawing from for your dissertation.
Yeah, they are, I mean, like any piece of media, a complicated text. There's aspects of the game that's incredible. The ecofeminist approach that they take is really great, but they also, have had some critiques about their appropriation of indigeneity, their use of real world cultures. So it's like any game, kind of a mixed bag. But yes, there is so much really amazing stuff going on there that's, I think, quite unique still today in games.
How many hours do you think you've put into, like, are you playing them a lot because you're working on your dissertation?
Yes, my like definitive dissertation playthrough of each game probably took 70 to 80 hours
Wow.
because I was reading like everything.
Oh yeah.
So it's a bit of a slog.
Yeah, no kidding. Getting
Yeah.
all the little lore bits through every little item that you find.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That kind of leads me into asking a question about your approach to the work that you do. And I want to get into defining each of the terms that you're using and things like that. But Andrew and I are really curious on when you're playing a game, are you playing it from the player's perspective, from a researcher's perspective? And are you considering things like game design in your research and in the arguments you're making in your dissertation? Or are you often pointing that towards the developers? And do you feel like it's more of a conversation you're trying to have with the developers?
I would say it's a little bit of everything. So I don't know how like into the academic terminology you want to get. But there's this concept that comes from a game scholar named Teal Taylor that games are assemblages, which means, they're kind of very complex objects that are the combination of everything from like, what does the hardware let us do? What kind of interactions can we have because of the hardware, which, gets into questions of accessibility all the way up to like the really complex, like what are the embedded cultural arguments that live in these objects, right? And so when we're studying them, often what we're trying to do as critical game scholars is kind of simultaneously have both perspectives. So be able to, on the one hand, kind of project ourselves as a player, which, there are many different kinds of players, and kind of approach it as what does it mean for me as a player to interact with this for the first time, for the hundredth time, and then approaching it also as an academic who is reading it through any number of critical lenses for everything from, what are the like nuts and bolts of the game design strategy to how are they making arguments, what kind of worldviews are these things situated in. So there are many different ways to come at it. In my work, I tend to try and kind of have the dual view of like, what is the intention of the developers? Which in games is also tricky because usually, if you're talking about a AAA game, like hundreds of people probably made this game. So intention is a pretty fuzzy concept. And then what is the impact? What is the object that we come to as players? So yeah, we kind of have to like simultaneously exist in a couple of different reading spaces, studying games from this perspective, especially.
Kenzie, I feel like this is such a rare field. I feel like you're like the only scholar I've come across who's able to mesh both your passions for academics, your passion for systemic change, and video games all in one. Do you feel like you created this role on your own? Tell us your journey, how you got here.
Yeah, so I actually got into critical game studies because when I was in my final, or when I was burning out for the first time in social work, which is kind of a career cycle that social workers typically go through several times, I took a study or a course on Coursera called Understanding Video Games that was taught by Dr. Sean Googlis at the University of Alberta. That's kind of an intro to the discipline of critical game studies. And I was like mind blown a little bit of like, what, you can study this, like this is a whole thing. And which is why I jumped ship to do my master's program with Sean Googlis at the University of Alberta. In Canada, we're especially robust in like feminist game scholarship, actually. So we're kind of a hub for kind of the critical feminist and intersectional game studies work.
That's great. Well, I think one of the reasons we're excited to have you on too is because you have that you enjoy video games yourself. And I mean, I'm sure that is true for other research in the field too, but sometimes when you're reading discourse around video games from these perspectives, it feels like the people who are looking at them don't always understand games from the player's perspective. So I think you having that as well is a really cool thing, and something that we're trying to capture on this podcast too, where we love video games, but then also want to talk about them and talk about them critically.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, in the violence prevention games sector in particular, there is a subset of the research that comes from people who do not like video games,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and don't really understand them as like media objects, which leads to some like interesting holes in the methodology, in my opinion, of how they study these things. So yeah, it's definitely not universal in people studying games that they necessarily like games, which
Yeah.
is yeah.
Absolutely. So that's maybe a good segue into kind of the main topic. So as you said at the top, one of your main areas of research is the intersection of video games and gender-based violence. Can you tell us what that means? Can you define that for us?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a lot of different things. I, tend to approach it from more of a reparative, or like what could games do perspective. So there is certainly a strain of scholarship which is linked to the larger violence in games discourse that kind of emerged, especially in the wake of the Columbine shooting, where we started to see these since the 70s, we've been seeing games are making the children violent arguments,
Yes.
but it really, yeah, the academic discourse about it really ramped up in the wake of the Columbine shootings. And so there is like kind of that subsection that's like, how is Grand Theft Auto ruining children? I tend to view that as not particularly constructive, in the ways that they're framing it. And so for me, the intersections of gender-based violence in games are mostly, how can we understand what representations of gender-based violence in games are doing? Because gender-based violence is something that happens in the world. So that doesn't, I don't think we should be saying that games should never represent these things, but rather what arguments are being made when games are representing them, and how can we kind of critique and pull apart those arguments? Are we seeing survivors' perspectives included in these representations? And often, especially in the case of like big budget games, the answer is no. And then kind of the application side of that, which is more connected to kind of my social work background, is how are games being deployed by survivors, by nonprofits, by educators for things like consent education, for awareness about domestic and sexual violence. And yeah, how are these things kind of like active in the world, and how can they help violence prevention, which is a traditionally not super tech savvy sector, kind of move in new directions and access new spaces and communities.
Yeah, that's great. So and just to kind of set the stage for people that might be unfamiliar with these terms, how would you define gender-based violence? How is that similar, different from sexual violence? What are these terms? How do they differ?
Yeah, so gender-based violence is an umbrella term that we kind of use to encapsulate kind of a connected group of forms of violence that are not necessarily perpetrated against people of a particular gender. That's a misconception that domestic and sexual violence is primarily a problem that affects cisgender women. It affects, everyone, including LGBTQ people at higher proportions. So gender-based violence is an umbrella that kind of understands that the structures of patriarchy and kind of these structures of hierarchy and power tend to result in different forms of abuses of power and relationships. So under gender-based violence, we would have sexual violence, which includes everything from street harassment to sexual assault. We would have domestic violence, which includes emotional and psychological abuse, as well as, physical forms of abuse. Gender-based violence also includes child abuse, and often elder abuse, although those are not usually my primary area of focus. I'm usually looking at abuse against adults. And we also kind of understand this umbrella to include things like comprehensive sex education and consent education as part of that picture. So it's kind of a broad way of understanding yeah, the forms of violence and oppression that are specifically linked to gender and sexuality and sexual expression.
Perfect. Very comprehensive answer. I
Yeah,
appreciate that. That's
you.
great.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to jump into obviously some of the positive ways you're using video games in a game that you also made, from what I understand. And Andrew and I had a chance to actually test it, and we thought it was really fascinating, and it taught me a lot about what games can be used for in terms of both positive education and be interactive and fun and interesting all at the same time. Can you talk a little bit more about It's Your Move?
Yeah, absolutely. So It's Your Move is a game project that I did in 2017, 18-ish, in partnership with the University of Alberta Sexual Assault Center and the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton. At that time, the two sexual assault centers were offering a training program to nightlife staff, so people who worked at bars and restaurants, called 5 Minute Friend, that was basically kind of a crash course in bystander intervention. So if you see things happening in the bar or the club or wherever you work that are concerning you, you're maybe concerned that someone is being set up for a situation of violence, something, potentially dangerous is happening. How can you, as someone that works in that environment, intervene and kind of try and create a safer space in these settings for the patrons that are there and for the workers? And we worked together on the 5 Minute Friend program to build It's Your Move, because one of the challenges of any bystander intervention training and many types of training of this is no one likes role play, right?
That is true. Yeah.
So,
As a therapist in our training, we
yeah.
would always dread like when we have to role play with each other, with professors. Yeah, no good.
Yes. Yeah, it's so cringy. Everyone's so uncomfortable, especially on topics like this. Like, no one wants
Yeah,
to role play as a sexual predator,
yeah,
right? Like, it's a
yeah,
very
yeah.
uncomfortable topic to engage in. And so the really nice thing about video games is it kind of, adds a layer of interface to that. You can kind of preset computer characters to be the creepy sexual predator. So it just creates, like, ironically, because these are skills that you're going to need in the real world with real people, but it's easier to practice them in some ways in this digital setting. And because video games are so great at these feedback loops, they give a really easy opportunity to kind of guide people towards the learning outcomes that you want. So when you're playing It's Your Move, if you guys tried it out, you probably noticed if you do the wrong thing, the thing that kind of the training would not direct you to do, you get a little bubble that says, oh, actually, like, being really confrontational with someone is probably not the way to go.
One of the questions or one of the scenarios, you had the decision to either immediately stop what was happening, which, I'm a little bit more confrontational in real life. And if I perceived some form of injustice happening, I'm not afraid to get in the middle of it. But the learning outcome for me was looking at that and getting that bubble come up to say, oh, well, maybe not everyone appreciates you doing that direct confrontation and more indirect ways to vector, that negative behavior, finding other ways to do that. And the idea was centering and please correct me if I'm wrong, Kenzie, but centering the victim in the conversation, not centering your own emotions, which I thought was a valuable learning outcome for me. So yeah, in the moment too, real time, right? Which is what's really cool about that.
Yeah, yeah. So, and because it's a game, you can get that feedback and you can just say, oh, I'll try again. Or, like, yeah, you can internalize it more easily than kind of getting like the lecture from the instructor of not to do that. So yeah, that's kind of the benefit that we saw the game providing. And like, it just kind of breaks up the format a little bit. But I think like a really important thing to keep in mind that has kind of emerged from that work and has been found to be true in a lot of the other academic research on using these kind of tools is that, like, a game alone cannot do this. A game is often a conversation starter, or it's part of a larger conversation and learning about how to do bystander intervention or consent or whatever it is, that we don't expect that we can just like drop a game with no preparation on somebody and suddenly they'll know how to do this thing, but rather it's part of one of many tools that we have in our toolkit to kind of open up conversations and encourage learning.
Yeah. If only it was as easy as one video game, just solved
I
all
know.
problems.
But I feel like the reverse argument says it though, where it only takes one game for someone to become violent. So that's kind of interesting, where you found that one game alone won't necessarily, it's one toolkit to improve pro-social behavior, let's call it that.
Mhm.
But do you feel like the opposite's true? And this is something Andrew and I were really interested in because it's something comes up in the game community all the time. The real question. It actually kind of what started our podcast. Do violent games lead to more violence? To sexual violence within games lead to more perpetrators? And does it just take one game, or is there some sort of exposure effect happening? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this argument is based in a concept that Andrew, you're probably very familiar with, which is Albert Bandura's social learning theory,
Yeah.
which, emerged from this series of studies he did where he had kids like watch an adult in a room with this blow up clown doll, and the adult would like punch the clown doll, and then the kid, if they saw the adult do that, would go in the room and also punch the clown doll. And like the conclusion from that study is that children mimic behavior that they witness, and witnessing that behavior causes them to like take on those behaviors in real life. And so that is the argument that's being made by a lot of this kind of, I call it the violence effects research, which argues that if you play Grand Theft Auto and you abuse a sex worker in Grand Theft Auto, that's you practicing abusing a sex worker. And thus, in real life, you're more likely to enact that behavior. And so that's the social learning theory argument that's often applied to this violence in video games discourse. And I think it really gets amped up in games more so. I mean, we see similar kind of moral panics happen around, violent television or movies. But I think it gets amped up in games because of the interactivity component that people imagine there's something more like practicing happening because you're pushing X.
There's some agency that watching a
Yes.
movie doesn't have. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the argument that people make. The research has not really borne that out. The research is quite inconclusive on violence effects. I certainly think it's a mistake to say there's no impact. This doesn't do anything. Like, do it, right? Because every piece of media we consume has some kind of impact on us. But a study that I find really useful to think about this through was conducted by people who actually originally were kind of on the like social learning theory wagon. But they started to like improve their methodology to think about the contexts that people play games in, and that, people are not just sponges who watch something and do that thing. We're capable of like moral interpretation, right? And so they did a study on Grand Theft Auto where they had someone watch someone else play an abusing a sex worker section of the game. And then they had the people play that section of the game again themselves. Many of them chose not to do those same actions, which, could be to do with the testing environment that they know that the researchers are watching them. But the really interesting finding was that their pro-social beliefs improved after watching that section of the game. And so that tells us that maybe when they were engaging with it, they were interpreting the content, not just mirroring it back, right? They were seeing something and they were thinking about what's happening here. And so, that's just one study in a pool of larger studies. There is no conclusive thrust in either direction with this violence effects stuff. But I think what is useful for us is to think about what opportunities for engagement and reflection do people have? And does the game encourage people to think about what's happening? And, that can be in the broader context of like, this is an anti-hero narrative. Like, we're not supposed to empathize with this hero. We're supposed to see them as a bad person. So it's much more complex than just kind of someone does something and thus now they know how to do that thing. And, it's easy to see that it's ridiculous to make that argument about many of the things. I have blown up entire planets in video games, and yet I'm not out here blowing up entire planets.
Maybe you just don't have the opportunity yet.
Yeah.
Don't
True.
have the means.
That's
Power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just keep me away from NASA. But I think when it's things that are more tangible to our real world, people tend to have kind of a fuzzier perspective of what the difference is.
Yeah, I think that that interactivity piece and how it affects the research is so interesting because I think you talk about those studies in one of the articles that you wrote as well. I think those same studies you were just speaking about, and I thought that was interesting and makes sense as a video game player. The interactivity changes how I interact with games. And that in the context, what you were just saying matters too. You know, if I am playing a game that is an anti-hero narrative, I'm much more willing to do unspeakable acts in the game. Whereas if I'm playing a game, Adolyn always makes fun of me for this, but if I'm playing a game where you can choose, right, be a good character or a bad
Mass
character,
Effect.
I can't be a bad character.
Baldur's Gate 3.
Yeah, even when I
He
go,
always chooses the correct. I'm like, why don't we just steal the money? And he's like, but that would be wrong. I'm like, but
it's true. Even when I go to set out a new playthrough, I'm like,
know.
this is my evil playthrough.
Yeah.
I start feeling bad. Something about the interactivity and the context it's happening in does change something. So I think that just speaks to what you were saying, the complexity of it, and that you can't just look at this from one angle. One of the things I was curious about with that kind of discourse around the impact on violence, like you were saying, or the impact of violent video games on violence. A lot of the discourse talks about GTA, about Grand Theft Auto. But I was curious, are there any other, like, have you seen other more modern examples? Because really, I mean, there's supposed to be a new Grand Theft Auto game soon-ish, but there hasn't been a new Grand Theft Auto since 2013, I think is when the fifth one came out. Are there other more modern games that present problematic narratives around gender-based violence?
Yes, is the short answer. There sure are. It's often a question, I guess, of degree and of scale. So at kind of the extreme end of the scale, games like No Mercy, which has been really the subject of a lot of moral panic this year because it includes, it's kind of, it's a pornographic game and it's kind of a sexual assault fantasy game in many ways. And it has been the subject of a very aggressive campaign by an anti-porn group from Australia that had big ripple effects in all of the platforms and everything. So, there are games like that pop up, once every 5 years, there's something like that causes a big stir. But we see these themes emerge in lots of games in varying ways. So I've done a bit of work on the Crystal Dynamics Tomb Raider reboot trilogy, which when they were kind of promoting the release of this game, there's a scene in the early section of the first game where Lara is sexually assaulted by somebody. And there was quite a bit of uproar about that. There was a lot of pushback. The developer said, oh no, like that's not sexual assault. That doesn't happen. But she is, she's groped in the scene, so they are able to kind of have plausible deniability if you have a very narrow definition of what sexual assault is. So that's a relatively recent series with a very well-known female protagonist that's facing things like that. So these themes do kind of tend to cycle through narratives. We are seeing a bit of improvement in representation of women and gendered minorities in games. It is gradually getting a little bit better, and with that is coming more centering of people's experiences and narratives in mainstream games. But we're definitely not, out of the woods on problematic representations by any means.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense, and I appreciate that because I know, so it's just interesting the pushback or the counter arguments you see where people will say, well, Grand Theft Auto is one example. Give me more, but there are more examples, or it becomes so all or nothing, right? People will say the list. Well, here's all these female protagonists, so the issue is solved. And yes, it's good, and maybe there's a lot of other pieces and layers and perspectives that can still be improved upon.
Yeah, and I think the tricky part that, I am sympathetic to developers is like these are important stories to tell, right? Like 1 in 3 women and 1 in 3 gender minorities will experience sexual or domestic violence in their lifetime. So pretending that it never happens is also not doing any service to the player communities. People do want to be able to reflect on these experiences, but they can be very traumatic and triggering experiences to engage with. So how you engage with them is a tricky line to walk for developers for sure, especially when, there is still a perspective that 20-year-old men are the primary audience for
Right.
games, even categorically that's not true.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you make such an interesting point about the context matters and what you're doing with the learning outcomes of it. So if you're just putting in something gratuitous or offensive just for the sake of putting it in the game, then I think it is kind of an important part for all of us as gamers and developers to question and go, but why? I am curious about, though, you talked about Bandura, and I think his work drew on Piaget's work on creating schemas. And video games, I believe in 2021 made $180 billion, so more than the film and TV combined. Do you feel like our schemas are being updated now based on these games? Because I saw a lot of the research was done on adults and people, above the age of 18, obviously because we're testing for things like sexual violence and things like that, which you can't really do with kids. But I'm curious about this new generation coming up and them playing all these games, and whether you think the Bandura's experiment was on kids. Do you think there's a more pronounced effect when you're younger? Are you more susceptible when you're playing games like GTA, or you don't see that in the literature at all, and it's really still contextual and individual?
Yeah, I think like the first problem is very little of the literature in this topic involves children at all, just because from a research ethics perspective, you would never get ethics approval to have 12-year-olds play GTA, even though 12-year-olds do play GTA, right? So that does create kind of like a weird hole in our knowledge, that it's quite difficult to understand what those engagements are for that population. Um, I do think it kind of goes both ways because on the one hand, like kids of the current generation do have better understandings of consent, and in general, much less like binaristic model of gender and sexual and romantic relationships than we did as millennials or generations past, because they do have, well, they have had better sex education, and kind of exposure to a broader set of understandings about these things. At the same time, we also know that particularly online multiplayer gaming spaces, have always had this real problem of toxicity and toxic masculinity. And with the rise of the manosphere, like we know that young men and boys in particular are just exposed to like a shocking array of really toxic ideas. Um, so I it's tricky studying any media object because you can never isolate that from everything else, right? There's no way to say, only tell me what you've learned from GTA and not what you've learned from YouTube, right? And so it's quite difficult to separate those things. But I do think, and this is just kind of is not an area that I'm deeply familiar with, but anecdotally, that we are seeing in the research, there is an increasing diversion of values and beliefs between young women and other gender minorities and young men. Because men are being radicalized more online. And so this definitely has come up in research with like university age students of, in many countries, I know in South Korea, I've seen this research that young women are finding it really difficult to engage with young men because they are kind of in like a different cultural training track than they tend to be. So yeah, it's tricky, and it's tricky to separate games from kind of the soup of everything else that's happening.
Yeah, that's really interesting because that's one thing I was thinking in advance of this conversation is there's the conversation about the games and the content of the games themselves, but then there's this surrounding, the dialogue about games and the gaming community and online gaming communities. And there's so much that happens in that's like its own thing.
Yeah, and I mean, if you are an adherent to social learning theory, the things you hear repeated by men on message boards or social media or whatever is going to have at least as much, if not more, impact than, something you see an animated character do in a game, right? So, And it's always with you. Whereas a game, still has kind of a constrained environment.
So, bringing it back to It's Your Move, the game that you developed. What was the reception to it? What were the learnings from it? What are some of the takeaways?
Yeah, it was really well received. People were really excited about it. In part, I think that's because gender-based violence prevention and most kind of social worky educational areas do suffer from like a dearth of innovative technologies in them. And so anything that's in that space is really exciting. In the training context, when the sexual assault centers were using it, they found people really enjoyed it. They found it definitely better than doing role play, and enjoyed using it. Using those kinds of tools always presents like technological limitations, just in terms of like how many iPads do you have in the training setting? And then that is a challenge that nonprofits using games and other technology are always going to run into, is just like, how do we get this into everybody's hands? But yeah, I think that the parts of it that were really beneficial was, yeah, kind of that opportunity to take a playful approach to something that often feels very uncomfortable to engage with playfully, because it is such a sensitive and serious topic. But that doesn't mean that our learning about it has to be like very regimented and boring, right? And so it's kind of a way to kind of lighten and shift our perspective on this, because especially when we're talking about bystander intervention, we don't want people to think this is the scariest thing that they could ever have to do in their lives, is intervene in a situation. We want them to think of it as just like, this is a thing that I know how to do at work, or this is a thing that I know how to do on public transit, right? And so it does kind of like de-escalate this, it's serious, but it de-escalates that like bystander effect obstacle of like, this is too scary to do, by kind of making it something that's more casual to practice, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And reminding people of the nuanced pieces of it too, that it's, bystander intervention isn't just when a extremely violent act is happening, you have to put yourself in the middle of it. Like, it can be these nuanced conversations.
Yeah, it's a proactive approach. It's prevention.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think developers can start to add stuff like this into their games without it being so like, this is specifically a game for prevention? But are there other things, perhaps more indirect ways, like the portrayal of female protagonists, or the portrayal even heteronormative values and things like that in games? What are your thoughts on some of that? And maybe you can speak to, there's developers have attempted some of those things, and then there's always this like weird pushback, and what is that? What do you think the culture is fighting against right now? We saw that with the new Dragon Age game. We've seen that with new characters being introduced in games like Overwatch. You see their backstory, and all of a sudden players feel affronted, or they call it wokeism, right? Or they're throwing DEI down your throat and stuff like that. So, yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's lots of ways, both subtle and less subtle, that developers can kind of engage with these things in like a mainstream game setting. And I think like all of them are beneficial. So as you've mentioned, like there has been a lot of progress in the last few years in big AAA games representing transgender characters in particular. There's always like a very vocal portion of the internet that's quite up in arms about that. But I think it's really beneficial. An interesting question about the representation of transgender characters in games is often, who is this for? Researcher in the States who was doing their dissertation kind of on this topic of, is this for trans people to see themselves represented in these spaces? Or if you look at someone like Krem in Dragon Age Inquisition, who really is there to be like, hello, I am your first trans friend.
Yeah.
I will answer your basic questions.
Yeah. Right.
And I think both are beneficial, right? But it's something that developers need to think about, is why are we putting this in here, and what are we trying to achieve by putting this in here? There's always going to be people who are upset about things that challenge entrenched power structures, and patriarchy and cis normativity are some of those. And there's also lots more subtle things that games can do. So, I mentioned my dissertation is looking at Horizon Zero Dawn. One of the really lovely things that Horizon Zero Dawn does is it models, because there's a female protagonist, and she has lots of male sidekicks. It models a lot of like really kind, like mixed gender relationships and interactions that are based on respect, that are based on kind of this like mutual understanding, that we don't see modeled that often in games, especially when we're kind of put in the position of a female character. Like, what does it feel like to be in a space where men just listen to and respect me? So there's lots of kind of more subtle things like that that developers can do, especially because we have kind of this embodiment opportunity in a video games of, to whatever extent we think we can inhabit somebody else's shoes, we are stepping into someone else's world and seeing the world through their perspective. And so there's lots of opportunities in that space to encourage us to think about perspectives other than our own.
Oh, I love that. That's a really great answer.
Yeah, that's really cool. What would you say, because our whole podcast here is about the intersection of video games and mental health. And I mean, I think, violence is a piece of mental health. But I'm sure people are maybe drawing their own kind of connections as to how this may, if developers do better representation, or like what that may do for people's mental health. But what are some of those impacts on mental health? I guess either negative or positive from all of the things we've been talking about today.
Yeah, it's a mix. You know, Definitely when we see these representations of gender-based violence, that have really not thought about what if the player is a survivor of gender-based violence, which,
Right.
I've argued in some of my work in Tomb Raider, for example. I don't think it occurred to them that the player might be someone who's experienced gender-based violence and is now inhabiting this body of a person who's being like constantly assaulted by men from all sides. So certainly there are situations like that where sometimes the effects can be not great. On the other hand, many people like really value being able to be in those embodied in that way, and find it really empowering. So I don't think that we could say yes, games are a good for mental health, or yes, games are a negative for mental health on this particular front. Um, it's definitely a mix of things, and it depends on who the player is. It depends on what they're playing. It depends on what background and experiences they're bringing to the play setting. It's complicated. I would say is the short and long answer.
Just like everything in psychology.
Yeah,
it's
it's
a little
true.
bit of both.
I know that was a very broad question. Complicated is a fair answer to that.
Kenzie, you kind of answered our penultimate or ultimate question, which was, are video games the hero and the villain in your narrative here? And I think we're probably bringing this to a close pretty soon, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share any last thoughts, anything you wanted to plug, any questions you might have, anything you wanted to share.
Yeah, I think, to connect to my previous answer, I don't know that I would put them in the hero or the villain box. But maybe video games are sort of a BioWare protagonist in that they have
Nice.
routes to choose, right? There are a series of choices that are made along the way. And depending on those choices, the impacts will vary, but at the end, it's just going to be a different colored light that ends the universe. I don't know.
Wait, she's back on that again. Stay, keep your planet safe, aliens.
I like that.
I, like Andrew, could never make a Renegade playthrough of Mass Effect. So I could never.
Can't do it. Oh, every once in a while, there's like a moment where it's funny to do the Renegade option. But other than that, I could never do it. Oh, well.
I don't know what that says about me.
Yeah. We'll dig into that in the debrief afterward.
That was a great answer, though, that video games they have a route to choose, and what that is we don't know, but they do have that choice.
Okay, my last question for you. What game had the biggest impact on you growing up?
Oh, boy.
I know. Just heavy-hitting questions here.
This is going to be a very 90s diversion answer. Neopets. Neopets are the biggest. like many, I think, particular millennial women, like I learned how to code because I needed to code my website for Neopets. I like learned how to be in online communities because I needed to be in Neopets. I was awake at 3 in the morning on dial-up looking after my
Wow.
Neopets.
That's awesome.
So
Wow.
That's fantastic.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with us. I felt like I learned so much.
Yeah, me too.
It was awesome. You're an incredible speaker. I think you're an incredible scholar in this area, and that we need more people like you. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time and your expertise.
yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Welcome back. All right. So this is Andrew and I's post interview analysis, and I thought Kenzie Gordon was incredible.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was blown away by just her ability to talk about some of these complex concepts in very simple terms. And I'm excited to dive into it with you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. What a phenomenal guest.
Yeah.
I feel like we were absolutely the ones learning throughout that
100%.
conversation.
As we should have been as
yes.
two cisgendered males.
Yes. Yeah.
We had to be the quietest people in the room.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. I think that's such an important piece. We know from research that the majority of domestic violence, sexual assaults are perpetrated by men against women. That isn't always the case, of course, but that is the majority from what the research tells us. And so
yeah,
we
the
wanted to be aware
Calgary
of that.
Women's Emergency Shelter says it's about over 70% of reported cases of domestic violence happen to women and are perpetrated by male identifying individuals. So
Right.
it's a pretty big number.
Yeah,
Yeah.
pretty big number, and particularly women who also identify in minority groups, so
yes.
women with disabilities, women, Indigenous
LGBTQ
women,
spaces.
LGBTQ plus spaces,
Yeah.
And so that's just an important piece we wanted to honor right up front. We're two guys talking about this, which is why we had Kenzie be the expert in the room.
Absolutely. And boy, was she the expert.
Oh my goodness!
Yes. Yeah. I know we wanted to talk about some of her research. So maybe we can start with some things that you learned prior to the interview. Or was there anything that you were like really wanted to talk about, or a question you asked that you were like, yes, or maybe you forgot to ask a question?
Yeah,
What do you feel?
absolutely. I think the piece that it's hard to say most interested in. I was interested in all of it, but one of the pieces that stuck out to me in reading her research beforehand, and then it came up a bit in our interview as well, was this idea of reactance. This idea that in one of the studies, they found that where they were using this violence prevention video game, they found that people who initially scored high on, they used what was called the rate myth acceptance scale.
Yeah.
And so people who scored high on that, so who endorsed views that might reflect sexual violence beliefs, I guess.
Well, and the rate myth acceptance scale looks at your tendency towards misogynistic belief systems, right? So it is around sexual violence, but it also asks things like, do you think women belong in the kitchen? On a scale of 1 to 5, who makes the sandwiches? That kind of stuff.
Yes.
So
thank you for clarifying.
Yeah. So it looks at it. No, but it asks overt questions and then covert questions as well, which I find is really interesting because when I was looking through research, and it was my first time coming across the RMA, and I was like, oh, some of these questions are really good to reflect on because they're unconscious biases that exist. Like it'll be like, who is stronger? Who do you think would win in sports and things like that? It challenges your preconceived belief systems around it too, which then the scale will, score differentially based on your acceptance of certain, gender differentiations in our society.
Right. Yeah. Very well said. So people who initially scored high on this scale engaged with this violence prevention video game.
Yeah.
And then afterwards found that those people were the most likely to actually score even higher on that same scale. So it was this idea that she talked about in the research called reactance, where people become more entrenched in their views when they're presented with a counter narrative.
Yeah, people double down, which is, it's interesting. I don't know how I feel about it, but I've come across it in my unconscious bias workshops as well. So there's this interesting research. There was a meta-analysis on whether unconscious bias workshops work or not. And what they looked at was basically people who are already open to changing their mind don't actually benefit that much from those workshops because they're already learning and they're fairly, malleable in their belief systems. But the people that possibly need it the most are the ones, may have the most problematic behavior or belief systems, double down. Yeah. They get worse in their isms, whether it's ageism or racism. And that is really surprising. Good point.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and almost a little bit dishearting sometimes.
I know. You're like, what do you do?
How do you work with this? But and I think it was interesting for me to reflect on, because as a therapist, I've worked with people on both sides of domestic incidents, victims and perpetrators, and I think it's, from that lens, it's always been heartening when I've worked with people that maybe are on the perpetrator side, and how they want to change and learn and grow, and how can I engage in more healthy relationships. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
But I also have to remember, I'm getting a biased sample. People who are coming to therapy are already inherently open to changing their mind.
Yeah,
like
if you've
you said,
already gotten to
right?
that point, you're probably willing to at least change. And I think they talk about this in therapy, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the biggest predictor of success is someone's willingness to change.
Yeah, willingness is huge.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have a ton of experience doing mandated therapy, and it'd be interesting to maybe get a guest sometime who is a therapist that does that. But I think that's a huge piece and a huge predictor. What about you? What was something that maybe surprised you or stuck with you from our interview with Kenzie?
I think there was quite a few different things, but so the other thing that surprised me that I read in her research, and she talked about as well, was how so it's kind of the opposite of your statistic, or your comment about reactance, which is people who do engage in video games that do demonstrate violence. So the classic example is the GTA one, and the sexual violence that's allowable in that game, don't repeat or increase their scores on the RMA either, though. When they've played the game, they've gone through that scenario, and then in research settings, they don't actually hold those beliefs. And so it's kind of shows, and there was a lot of research that I did as well that showed that violent video games don't increase people's tendency towards violence either. It's quite almost like a debunked myth in some ways.
Yeah.
And I thought there'd be more research to say, no, for sure, there's at least some effect on it. And Kenzie did say this. She said, it's not that they don't have any effect, but they don't have that statistical significant effect we're looking to maybe, say with conclusion, yes, they do. And that did surprise me a little bit. I thought people who enjoy that gratuitous violence in those games may have a tendency to increase that after playing the games, but it's not the case.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah. Super interesting. And I appreciate, I think this was one of my takeaways from the whole interview, is that, which kind of makes sense with a topic like this, it's all nuanced. There's a lot of layers to it. And that, there isn't this direct violent video games are causing violence in people. And like she said, it would be a bit naive of us to think they have no impact on us.
No.
Whether positive or negative, there's something we're consuming, just like all of our media that we consume constantly in our culture. It's going to have some impact on us, as impact on our schemas, impact on how we view the world, each other, how we move through the world.
Yeah, and some confounding variables around that are most of the research is done on 18 plus individuals. So that's usually, your brain is, going through a formation period later on as well, but the most formative years are, under 18, and we can't really do any research on how much of it is maybe affecting our brains or our belief systems, but it certainly feels like it. What do you think? You've worked with youth as well,
Yeah. It's hard to say. That was such an interesting part of the interview too, was acknowledging that, it's pretty hard to do research on
no ethics
12-year-olds playing Grand Theft Auto. Even though, like Kenzie said, we know that 12-year-olds are playing Grand Theft Auto.
That's the thing, right? The research can't do it, but it is a phenomena in society.
Yeah.
So, and we're concerned about it. And I'm sure one question the parents are probably listening and thinking well, what do we do? Should we limit the exposure of violence, especially domestic violence portrayals or gender-based violence portrayals in video games? Or after hearing that it doesn't really change anything, there's no point.
Right. Yeah. It's hard. It's hard to give any conclusive answers around it. I'm not here to, I'm not a child development expert. So that's not my specialty as a psychologist. But I think, where I put my focus and what I'm interested in is, what is the kind of culture around video games, or the conversation around video games, or how is that maybe impacting kids? When maybe it's less about the content. We still have to make decisions. Is this content appropriate?
Yeah, absolutely.
For the age and stage.
And there are ratings for that
for
are government mandated. They're on video games. And
there's a reason the ESRB was put into existence.
Exactly. And so parents can adhere to those. And there's a list of what makes those ratings. You can go on the ESRB website and look to see, okay, well, what ratings are appropriate for what age and why.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think part of it is, anytime I've come across, let's call it effective parenting, I think it's about what are the conversations you're having with your kids around the media that they're consuming.
Yeah.
'Cause this will come up a lot. Kids are watching TV shows that technically are rated for older ages, right? But I think it's if you can engage in a healthy conversation with your kid about what is being presented, what are their thoughts on it, helping them find that distinction between fiction and reality in that more nuanced way.
Yeah.
I think that can be a healthy piece too.
Yeah.
It was something that really stuck with me too, that Kenzie said was thinking about why are things being included in games and, what's the perspectives and conversations that's
Who's
creating.
the target audience?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big part of it, because it's, she was talking a little bit about this idea of the manosphere and all of that. I think that the conversations that happens around games, the conversations that can happen between, in online games and between communities, those are pieces that you got to pay attention to as well.
Yeah.
So again, it's not all about the content.
No, 100%. There's the context as well.
Yes.
Yeah, which makes a big
Nice.
difference.
Well done.
Yeah. Well, speaking of context, I think it's important to contextualize a conversation with some of the things we learned about what's happening in Calgary in regards to gender-based violence.
Absolutely.
So I learned through the primary source being the CPS, but the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter releases a report every year talking about the rates of domestic violence. And underneath that, there's different kinds: intimate partner violence, sexual-based violence, and that sort of thing. And they reported in just last year alone, there was over 4,000 cases of domestic violence in Calgary alone.
Yeah.
And that roughly 1 in 2 individuals will either know somebody or will have experienced some form of domestic-based violence in their lifetime, which is a huge number. Almost 50%. We either know somebody or you will be the victim of it.
Yeah.
So
100%. And that's it's a staggering statistic to really think about,
Yeah.
right? In our city alone,
Yeah.
4,000 incidents responded to by the Calgary Police Service in the last year. And that's just the ones that are reported.
Yeah.
So you have to imagine the number is probably a lot higher.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So this isn't some faraway issue. This is something that's very relevant to us right here locally. I was looking at a report. It was from a few years ago, I think from 2019, but from the Association of Alberta Sexual Assault Services.
Yeah.
And they were estimating that in Calgary, again, Calgary alone, there are estimated to be over 352,000 adults who are survivors of sexual abuse, sexual assault.
352,000. What's the population of Calgary? 1.5 million?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
That's all. It's 1 in 4 almost.
Yeah.
That's, yeah.
And again, the number's probably higher than that.
Yeah.
So it's this super relevant thing, especially as we know that video games are becoming bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
It's part of why we thought this was a relevant conversation. And as Kenzie said near the beginning of the interview, I think this is something that happens clearly from the statistics we just said. Gender-based violence is something that's happening. And so it shouldn't be something that is never explored in video games.
Yeah, that was really interesting too, right? To say that if something exists in society, we can definitely reflect it back in our art as coming from the acting perspective. It's not like I would ever say no to playing roles that may portray some of these things that happen in the world, but how are we doing it and how mindful are we on? And in my industry, we had to, we had this comeuppance, the Me Too movement. Sexual-based violence was prevalent in our industry, and I'm sure it's more than it ever should be. I mean, even one case of it is too much. And so we had to create a whole new class of workers and professionals called intimacy directors,
Right.
and intimacy coordinators,
Yeah.
to either be there to help coordinate and direct actual scenes that may display violence and gender-based violence, and on top of that, also be there to coordinate and direct healthy examples of interactions between our genders and intimacy. And the fact that something like that needed to exist, it sucks, it's sad, it's an indictment of our society, but it also shows that it is a ever-present issue.
Yeah.
And I don't know if video games have I know from what I've read, that intimacy coordinators are now becoming popular on video games as well, either through intimate scenes. And it's all about the the whole process, the pre-conversation to any intimacy. They're there during the intimacy, and then they're there after to debrief it as well, so that there's protections around the actors, but also the witnesses of that. And for me, it's been normalized because I started this career fairly recently. But I can't imagine there was a time in which it wasn't.
Yeah.
Like, it seems so obvious to me now.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is one of those weird double-edged things where, like you said, on the one hand, it's kind of an indictment of our society that we need this.
Yeah.
Because it was a problem that it had to address, and that problem shouldn't be there in the first place.
Exactly.
And, a very heartening sign of, hey, here's one really proactive way that we're trying to intervene and change the narrative around this and make people feel safer and more comfortable.
But what always gets me sometimes when I think about it, and I work with intimacy coordinators and directors, I go, man, like, I really stand on the shoulders of people who are often victims of this society that we're in, and their careers were ruined, or years down the road they had to advocate for themselves, which outs themselves, which puts them in this terrible position. We see what happens to them, and intimacy coordinators wouldn't exist if there weren't so many brave people out there saying we need to change. We need something to change.
Absolutely.
And I think having Kenzie on to talk about this, like, it was very meaningful for me. I'm like, this is good. Like, our podcast is doing something pretty good. We're honoring a really important topic that is going to be a topic of conversation for, and hopefully things change, but we're just looking at these statistics. So
yeah, absolutely. Well said. Yeah. So I think on that prevention side of things, we want to talk a little bit, because that was a big part of Kenzie's approach, right? Is violence prevention, and how can we use video games to actually educate, which I think is such a cool thing. And the fact that interactive component can make people engage in a different way. Make it less of this serious thing where you're being scolded about a topic, as most people, even if it is a topic you care about,
well,
like to be scolded.
We just learned you get entrenched anyways.
Right.
Very few people in the history of humankind change because you shame them into changing. Like, it doesn't.
So I think this is such a cool method to try and make some of that change happen. But we wanted to spend a few minutes also talking about, again, here in Calgary, some of the resources that are out there, some of the programs that are out there, that there are moves being made to support people. So some of the cool ones that stood out to me that are just worth it for people to know. So SHIFT is a program local to Calgary, and their whole thing is primary prevention. So doing research and education to help change people's perspectives, to change policy, in order to prevent violence before it even happens, which is a very, very cool thing. So
the source of it,
they're local, trying to make some changes that way. There's this program that's been running for quite a while, I think over 10 years, but I couldn't figure out for sure. There's a program out of the Center for Sexuality in Calgary called Wise Guys.
Okay.
I think the guys are spelled with a Z.
Oh,
so it's cool.
Yeah.
But it's a really neat program that's essentially it's aimed at grade 9 male identified youth. I think it's expanded now to cover different ages, and it's across Canada as well. But primarily it's for grade 9 male identified youth, and it's all about healthy relationships, sexual education, consent, teaching them these things in order to, again, be that primary prevention method, which I think,
that's so cool.
What a cool thing,
that's
right?
So cool.
One of the things I was reading about in one of Kenzie's articles as well was that often people get confused even on the definition of sexual assault.
Yes.
That people get surprised that unwanted kissing, unwanted touching, even if it doesn't evolve into something else, that alone is still sexual assault, or can be sexual assault. And is sexual assault if it's unwanted.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't know that. And so programs that are aimed at educating young people and teaching them about these things, because where else are you going to learn about it?
Totally.
I think that's huge, right?
Totally.
And to me, very heartening that there's something like that exists, especially right here.
Yeah, well said. Thank you for bringing that up. I think we're not here to say that society's not messy, but we're here to say that by having these conversations, hopefully we're creating a safer space for everybody. And that seemed like what Kenzie's mission was. What I loved about it is she wasn't like, video games are bad. Her last words around whether they're the hero or the villain, she said, well, it's like it's a Bioware game. You get to choose the ending, and we get to do that now. So the reasons I want to talk about this is the Calgary Sexual Assault Response Team, CSART, through the AHS. And what was really cool about me reading about this resource is that you can report a domestic violence or sexual assault related violence to the AHS without the police getting involved, and within 7 days. So it's one of the things that I think one of the myths around reporting violence is that people think you have to do it right away, and that you can't take some time to think about whether it's the right thing for you in the moment. And you absolutely can, and that these cases don't have to go through the police services, which sometimes can be a barrier for people. And there's some fear possibly around that. And so there are some professional resources available to you to seek help that circumvent some of those processes and go straight to the medical services. So doctors, counselors, and all of those are given to you through this AHS service. And you, and my hope is you will be supported throughout that whole process.
Yeah, that's a great resource. I know the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter also, I mean, they alone are a great resource.
Yes.
They have a phone line that you can access and is a great resource for these types of situations.
Yeah.
And they'll help kind of resource you, help direct you to where else you need to go.
Yeah.
But they're a wonderful organization for both victims. But what I think is cool is there's also a program through them or through their broader organization, Fears Not Love.
Yeah.
That's a men's counseling program that's actually aimed at not just men, but again, we know the majority of perpetrators are men, but it's for any partner who recognizes that they want to learn how to create a better sense of safety in their relationship. So partners who maybe recognize they've used some abusive behavior or aggressive behavior or harmful behaviors or controlling behaviors. There's a lot of versions of that.
Yeah.
And there's a counseling program through this organization that's specifically for them.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
I think what a cool thing too, right? That it's how can we intervene on both sides of the equation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was really inspired by this conversation, that
too.
there's some hope around this stuff, and of course deeply saddened at the same time that it exists in the first place. And that dichotomy was interesting to explore. I never thought starting this podcast with you that we would have a guest of this caliber, first of all, but also this topic. So, so profound. I thought we were just gonna be games are fun, but and then you do the research, and I want to say thank you for doing this with me, and having this conversation with her, and being such an amazing person. For knowing your stuff. You're obviously a fantastic therapist.
Oh, wow. Thanks.
But I think it's really important for men, and I'm speaking on my own behalf, not yours necessarily, but to surround themselves with friendships that explore these emotions too. And I think what I learned from this is in some of the games that Kenzie was talking about, there's this backlash against the No Mercy game and things like that. And whether or not that, I'm not going to talk about the right or wrong of that game existing, but I think it's important for men to talk about these feelings. Often games are a way for us to connect. I know how many times I've just sat on a couch with you and we're talking about deep life stuff, but we need some stimulus at the same time. But at least we can talk about those deep emotional things. And I think what I was learning from this, and we talk about this in cognitive science, is to change your schemas, you need to change the distributed cognitions around it, which is another way of saying the culture. We have to change the brains around us and in ourselves to talk about these things more openly, to express the good and bad of it, and then hold each other a little bit accountable too. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for saying that.
Yeah.
And thank you for having these conversations, because I agree. I think this is going to be one of the coolest things about this podcast going forward is being able to have these conversations and for us to be lifelong learners as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we know we're going to throw up some resources.
We're going to throw up.
Why did I say that? We will. This is such a hard conversation. We're going to throw up. We're going to put up some resources at the end of this episode on the screen.
No, you said the right thing. I'm just not making me to you.
Why you got to do that to me? Got to cut the tension once in a while.
I know.
Got too serious.
Gotta add the joke. Yeah.
So we're going to put some resources up on the screen at the end
Absolutely.
of this episode that are related to this topic. So if you ever need those resources, they're there for you.
Well, speaking of lifelong learners,
Yes.
it's time for our skill testing question.
Skill testing question. Let's
Yes.
end the episode as we always do. So our whole topic in our interview has been about, well, part of it is about perspectives, right? Being able to take other perspectives, think outside of your own box. So there is an idea in psychology and developmental psychology that is about the ability for a person to understand that people have different perspectives, different thoughts, attitudes, emotions, beliefs, and that other people's thoughts and attitudes may differ from their own perspective.
This is theory of mind.
Yeah, you got it. My question was going to be, what is this called? Part 2.
Okay. Yes.
Oh, first of all, congratulations.
Yes, I
you
got
did
one.
it.
Thank you.
Let's celebrate that.
Yeah.
What age range is this estimated to primarily start emerging?
This is interesting because I did do some cognitive science research on this when I remember I was a child. So you get object permanence in the first 6 months, roughly, right?
Sure, that sounds right.
I think so. And then you can start to have theory of mind within the first 3 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's an interesting thing where our brains come with this, and we don't know why, but like babies will recognize their mums, right? And the theory was there's some hormonal or like oxytocin connection that you make right away and that sort of thing. But then they've done things where they've shown like pictures and things like that, and babies will respond to their mom's faces differently, which I would argue, I'm like, that means they know it's someone outside of them.
Right.
You know, which is sure, they don't have self-awareness, so they don't know the idea of a mind, but some cognitive science scholars will argue that that's evidence of consciousness and perspective taking, because you're saying, I know that they know it's not their mom, but they like, also another thing is like babies will recognize smiles. Right. And I can do a happy face on a picture and they'll recognize that. But if I turn the picture upside down, they'll get upset. And so what is it? Do we have some like pre-made hardware that's already set up for us, or the software, you know? So anyways, yeah.
Well, now you're just showing off.
I know.
You're just trying to earn extra points. But yes. Generally, people would say, I think between ages 3 to 5 is a rough age range. But there's lots of, can it develop earlier? Does it sometimes come later? It's a complex issue. It's not like it's there and then you just have it. It's developing over time. But well done.
Yeah.
Dang. All right, you get extra points.
Thanks.
You get 110%.
I don't have theory of mind.
Well, that's too bad.
I feel like I'm having this conversation with myself.
Whoa. We'll talk about that off camera.
I think you're going to get this one.
Well, pressure's on now.
So this is a 3-part question now.
Three parts?
Okay. This is a skill testing question based on Kenzie Gordon's interview.
Okay.
What video game company did she mention in the interview?
BioWare.
Nice. Nailed it.
Okay.
How many games has BioWare made? And this is just, you give me a rough estimate.
All right.
You can give me a range. How many do you think they've made? And then the third part is, can you name at least 5 of them?
Oh, that I can do for sure.
Yeah, okay.
I'm pretty sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Number of games. Okay, this is tricky because BioWare, because initially my thought is Baldur's Gate, the original ones, but I don't think they were still, it was Black Isle Studio that made those ones, I think. So when did they become BioWare? This is the question.
You're so smart. You knew that. Yeah.
So I think, I could be wrong, I think they became BioWare when they started making Neverwinter Nights.
Okay.
So I'm going to say Neverwinter Nights, Neverwinter Nights 2.
Okay.
Well,
No, you're right.
But I'm trying to get the number of games.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Okay. Jade Empire, which I've never played, but that is a game they made. I'm pretty sure. Knights of the Old Republic. They didn't make Knights of the Old Republic 2. Obsidian made that. Then it would have been, Mass Effect, which was 1, 2, and 3. They made the Dragon Age games. So Dragon Age, Dragon Age 2, Dragon Age Inquisition, Dragon Age Veilguard, which is the newest.
Yeah.
Were there any others that I'm missing? Those are the big ones. Oh, they made Anthem. and they made the MMO Star Wars: The Old Republic.
Oh, I was gonna say I can't believe you missed that one. Yeah.
So that's, I'm gonna say 13 games.
Yeah, that's really close.
Really?
The estimate's around 20.
Oh,
but
well, that wasn't
no,
that
no, no, no.
close.
But that's games that they've also had like partial development.
All right.
In. But the main titles are roughly around 15.
Wow.
So,
okay.
And I don't know which ones off the top of my head you missed because that's not.
All right. Fair enough.
Yeah,
but that was pretty close.
Yeah,
I
I've
named
never
more
been
than
more.
5.
Oh my god, I've never been more attracted to you. That was so incredible.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was really amazing. Well, any last words?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think we're just grateful to Kenzie for doing the podcast with us, and grateful to you for having this post discussion. And I'm excited for next time.
Yeah. Check out all the resources after this episode and check out Kenzie's work as well. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.